poor Lakota blacksmith built a cabin with his bare hands until a mail-order bride saw his strength. The call of the Wild West often conjured images of bustling towns, golden opportunities, and a certain brand of rugged individualism. Yet for Elias, the vast, unforgiving landscape was merely a reflection of his own stark existence. He was Lakota by blood, blacksmith by trade, and in the eyes of the burgeoning settler community, little more than a phantom, a whisper of a past they wished to forget. His hands, calloused and scarred, were not merely tools for shaping iron, but instruments of defiance against a world that sought to break him. Every swing of his hammer against the anvil, every grunt of effort as he hauled timber, was a silent testament to a spirit that refused to yield. He was building his cabin with his own two hands, log by painstaking log, in a clearing so remote it seemed to exist outside the very fabric of time. It was a dwelling born of raw physical might and a desperate, aching need for a place that was truly his own, a sanctuary against the constant gnawing chill of prejudice that permeated the air like an invisible fog. The cabin, crude yet resolute, was a metaphor for Elias himself, strong, unyielding, deeply rooted, yet perpetually isolated. The sun would set, bleeding hues of orange and purple across the distant peaks, painting the sky with a fleeting beauty that seemed to mock the endless, monotonous labor, the quiet ache in his bones. He labored through the blistering summer and the biting winds of autumn, his breath pluming in the crisp air, his muscles screaming their protest with every lift, every nail driven. He was a man defined by his solitude, a silent sentinel against the encroaching tide of modernity, a living embodiment of a strength that most would never truly see or understand. The whispers followed him, faint as the rustle of dry leaves, casting him as an outsider, a relic. Yet he continued to build, fueled by a stubborn pride and a desperate, unspoken longing for a life that felt, for once, anchored and secure. And then, the world, in its cruel, ironic fashion, decided to send him a mirror. A woman from a world he could barely fathom, carrying her own burdens, searching for her own anchors. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The stage was set for a collision of two disparate worlds, two souls adrift on the turbulent currents of a changing frontier. Sarah, disembarking from the dusty stagecoach, was a stark contrast to the rough-hewn landscape and its equally rough inhabitants. Her dress, though travel-worn, hinted at a life far removed from the dirt and desolation of the Lakota territories. Her eyes, however, held a weariness that belied her delicate features, a profound weariness born of choices made and paths abandoned. She had traveled halfway across the continent, driven by a desperate hope and a silent, unnamed terror that had chased her from the manicured lawns of her former life. The town itself was little more than a collection of splintered wood and wary glances, a stark reminder that this was not the fresh start she had envisioned in her lonely letters. The local women eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and pity, their whispers like venom, sharp and cutting. It was a community that clung to its prejudices like a lifeline, a place where difference was not merely observed, but judged, condemned. Elias, when he finally arrived to claim his intended, was not the image she had conjured from his brief, formal correspondence. He was a specter of raw power, a man carved from the very rock of the land, his face a landscape of stoic endurance. His silence was not merely an absence of words, but a palpable presence, a heavy cloak that seemed to shroud a multitude of unspoken stories. Yet, in the depths of his dark, watchful eyes, Sarah perceived something more profound than the settlers' dismissive glances. She saw not the savage of their fearful tales, but a man burdened by an immense quiet strength, a profound resilience that resonated with the hidden depths of her own battered spirit. It was a strength that was not aggressive or boastful, but deeply, intrinsically rooted, like an ancient tree weathering an endless storm. The way he held himself, the subtle tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible flicker of something akin to apprehension in his gaze, it spoke volumes where words would have failed. This was not the future she had dreamed of, perhaps, but it was a future that promised a certain authenticity, a brutal honesty that was, paradoxically, a comfort after years of living behind veils and polite fictions. The townspeople watched, their faces a tableau of condemnation, as Elias, without a word, simply gestured towards his wagon, a silent invitation, a grim acceptance of their shared, uncertain destiny. Their initial days together in the crude, half-finished cabin were a study in strained silence and profound, unspoken understanding. The air between them hummed with a tension that was not hostile, but heavy with unacknowledged pasts and uncertain futures. Elias worked, his rhythm a constant reassuring pulse in the quiet clearing. Sarah, with a quiet efficiency born of necessity, began to carve out a semblance of a home, each scrub of a floorboard, each neatly folded garment, a small rebellion against the chaos of her former life. She watched him, truly watched him, as he labored, his muscles rippling under his worn shirts, the sweat beading on his brow like droplets of dark gold. It was not the brute force that captivated her, though there was plenty of that, but the deliberate precision, the immense patience in every task. He moved with the quiet grace of a creature perfectly attuned to its environment, his connection to the earth profound and undeniable. His words were few, often nothing more than a gruff assent or a terse instruction, yet his eyes, when they met hers, held a depth of emotion that spoke volumes. They were eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, eyes that held the echoes of forgotten songs and untold tragedies. She found herself drawn to this silent strength, this unyielding core, a stark contrast to the brittle facades she had grown accustomed to. It was a strength that did not demand or boast, but simply existed, an anchor in a tumultuous world. She too carried a silence, a carefully constructed wall around a past she dared not revisit. The quiet of the cabin became a strange sort of sanctuary, a space where their respective wounds could breathe, could perhaps even begin to mend, unspoken. Outside, the town continued its low hum of disapproval, their presence an affront to the prevailing order. Sarah felt their stares like pinpricks, their judgment a constant weight. But within the rough-hewn walls, a fragile, nascent understanding began to unfurl, a delicate tendril of connection between two souls bound not by love, not yet, but by a shared isolation and a mutual, desperate need for sanctuary. They were two broken things, finding a strange, almost sacred solace in the presence of each other's quiet endurance. Elias carried his past like a hidden wound, a phantom limb that ached with every step. It was not the kind of story told around a campfire, full of brave deeds and noble sacrifices, but a quieter, more insidious kind of pain, etched into the very fiber of his being. He had watched, as a young boy, the slow erosion of his people's way of life, the forced relocation, the broken treaties that littered the land like fallen leaves. The poverty that defined him in the eyes of the white settlers was not merely a lack of gold or possessions, but a profound spiritual dispossession, a stripping away of identity, purpose, and inherent worth. His father, a respected warrior, had been reduced to an echo of his former self, his spirit crushed by the relentless march of a civilization that saw him as little more than a nuisance, an obstacle to progress. Elias had inherited that same quiet fury, that same profound sense of loss, but also an unyielding determination to carve out his own existence, to not be entirely consumed by the current. The blacksmithing had become his solace, the intense heat of the forge a purgative fire, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel a defiant beat against the silence of his despair. He remembered the day his family's small parcel of land, promised by solemn decree, was unilaterally annexed for a mining venture, a betrayal that tasted like ash in his mouth. He had been a boy, powerless, forced to watch as the earth, sacred and ancient, was desecrated, its bounty plundered. The incident had solidified his distrust, his resentment, transforming him into the stoic, guarded man Sarah now knew. He saw the world through the lens of that fundamental betrayal, a world where promises were brittle and justice a phantom. His strength, therefore, was not merely physical, but a force of will, a refusal to be utterly extinguished. It was a strength born of necessity, forged in the crucible of injustice and honed by endless years of fighting for every scrap of dignity. He knew what it meant to be stripped bare, to have one's spirit trampled, And it was this profound understanding that drew Sarah to him, though she could not yet articulate why. He had learned to exist on the margins, to find sustenance in the remnants, to build with his own hands what the world had sought to deny him. This quiet defiance, this fierce independence, was the true bedrock of his being. Sarah's past, unlike Elias's, was not defined by injustice against a community, but by a more intimate, suffocating form of betrayal. She had grown up in a respectable family back east, surrounded by the trappings of comfort and social expectation. Her life had been a meticulously stitched tapestry of polite smiles, hushed conversations, and unspoken rules. Her family had been a pillar of the community, or so it seemed from the outside. But beneath the polished veneer of gentility lay a decaying truth. Her father, a man of considerable influence and cold, unyielding ambition, had orchestrated her life with the precision of a master puppeteer. She was to marry well, to secure the family's lineage, to be a silent ornament in his grand design. The man chosen for her, a prominent merchant, was everything her father desired: wealthy, well-connected, utterly devoid of warmth or genuine affection. Sarah had been a pawn in a game of status and power, her own desires, her own spirit systematically stifled. The true horror had unfolded slowly, like a poisonous bloom. Her fiancé, a man of impeccable public reputation, harbored a cruel streak, a possessive, manipulative nature that began to reveal itself in subtle, chilling ways. The whispers of his previous indiscretions, easily dismissed as gossip by her family, had grown louder, more insistent, until she could no longer deny the ugly truth. He was a man who saw women as property, to be controlled, broken, and ultimately consumed. The final straw had been a physical confrontation, a moment of stark terror that ripped through the delicate fabric of her carefully constructed life. She had fought back, driven by a primal instinct for survival, leaving him bruised and enraged. The ensuing scandal, hushed up by her father, had left her with a choice: a life of silent suffering as a compliant wife, or utter ruin and social ostracization. She chose flight, a desperate escape under the cloak of night, embracing the anonymity of the mail-order bride system as her only viable option. The journey west was a severing, a frantic tearing away from a past that threatened to devour her. She arrived in this desolate land not seeking love, but simply a haven, a place where she could breathe, where the air was not thick with deceit and the suffocating weight of societal expectation. Her strength, then, was not one of overt power, but of profound resilience, a quiet refusal to be crushed, a fierce desire for self-preservation that had led her to the very edge of the world, to a man who, like her, carried his own heavy burdens. The uneasy peace of the clearing, where Elias's cabin stood like a lonely sentry, could not long withstand the simmering resentments of the burgeoning town. The arrival of Sarah, a woman from the east, and her decision to remain with Elias, a Lakota man, was an affront, a challenge to the rigid social order they so desperately sought to establish. The whispers, which had previously been faint as a summer breeze, escalated into a biting wind, carrying with them the venom of prejudice and fear. Children, emboldened by their parents' veiled contempt, would sometimes throw stones at the edge of the clearing, their high-pitched taunts echoing through the trees. Men, emboldened by liquor and a collective sense of righteous indignation, would ride past on their horses, their stares lingering, their expressions a mixture of contempt and thinly veiled threat. Elias ignored them, or seemed to, his face a mask of stone, his hands continuing their tireless work at the forge. But Sarah felt every glance, every word, every unspoken condemnation. She saw the way their presence, their very existence, chipped away at the fragile sense of belonging she was trying to build. One evening, a group of men, led by Bartholomew Bart Thorne, the self-proclaimed moral compass of the town, rode right up to the cabin. Their faces were flushed, their eyes narrowed with a predatory gleam. Bart, a man whose piety was as thin as his patience, dismounted with an air of self-importance. He spoke in a low, dangerous tone, his words laced with thinly veiled threats, accusing Elias of poaching, of stealing livestock, of being a bad influence on the community. His eyes, however, were fixed on Sarah, a possessive hunger twisting his features. He offered her a chance to leave, To return to civilization, to escape the savage. Elias stepped forward, his silence a more potent weapon than any shouted word. His sheer physical presence, the coiled power in his frame, was enough to make the men pause. The tension in the air was palpable, stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah, her heart pounding against her ribs, stood firm, her hand finding Elias's arm, a small but defiant gesture of solidarity. She met Bart Thorne's gaze with a steady, unwavering fire, her own quiet resolve burning bright. The men, unnerved by the combined strength of their silence, eventually retreated, their threats fading into the twilight. But the encounter left an indelible mark, a chilling reminder that their sanctuary was fragile, constantly under siege. The cabin, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a fortress under siege, its walls strong but its inhabitants vulnerable to the gathering storm. The confrontation with Thorne and his ilk, though outwardly resolved, left a tremor in the quiet world of the cabin, a ripple of unease that settled between Elias and Sarah. The unspoken solidarity they had shown in the face of external threat was a powerful bond, yet it also exposed a raw nerve, a vulnerability they both struggled to acknowledge. The unspoken questions hung heavy in the air. How long could they withstand this siege? Was their quiet defiance merely inviting greater harm? For Sarah, the memory of Thorne's predatory gaze, the thinly veiled threat in his words, brought back the suffocating fear of her past. She had fled one cage, only to find herself potentially entrapped in another, albeit of a different making. Doubt, like a creeping vine, began to wind its way around her heart. Was she simply a burden to Elias, dragging him deeper into the prejudiced mire of the town? Had she, in her desperate flight, simply traded one form of confinement for another? She would watch Elias at the forge, his back to her, his movements powerful and precise, and wonder if his stoicism was merely an impenetrable wall. Could he ever truly accept her, a woman from a world so alien to his own? Did he regret bringing her here, exposing himself to further condemnation? Her own emotional scars, though healing, were still tender, prone to flaring with fresh pain. Elias, too, felt the weight of their precarious existence. The town's animosity was not new to him, but Sarah's presence amplified its sting, transforming a personal burden into a shared vulnerability. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the quiet tremor in her hands, and a profound guilt gnawed at him. Had he, in his own desire for a companion, for a semblance of a normal life, put her in harm's way? His silence, usually a shield, now felt like a barrier, preventing him from offering comfort, from articulating the raw, confused emotions swirling within him. He was a man of action, not words, and the nuances of emotional comfort eluded him. He would often retreat to the woods, walking for hours, the weight of their shared struggle a heavy cloak upon his shoulders. He questioned his own judgment, his own capacity to protect, to provide. The strength that had built the cabin, that had sustained him through years of hardship, suddenly felt brittle in the face of this new, more complex challenge. They circled each other, two wounded animals in a shared den, each afraid to disturb the fragile truce, each grappling with a profound sense of uncertainty, their unspoken doubts a silent, corrosive force. The simmering tension finally boiled over, not with a sudden explosion, but with the chilling inevitability of a slowly rising tide. It began with subtle acts of sabotage, a broken window at the blacksmith shop, tools dulled or missing, then escalating to a more direct assault. One harsh morning, Elias awoke to find his small patch of tilled earth, where Sarah had carefully planted what meager crops they hoped would sustain them, trampled and scorched. Crude, hateful symbols were scrawled on the cabin walls, a stark and undeniable message. The quiet defiance they had exhibited now seemed to ignite a fiercer hatred in the townsfolk, particularly in Bart Thorne, whose ambition for local power fueled his fervent bigotry. He rallied the town, painting Elias as a menace, a dark stain on their civilized landscape, and Sarah as a fallen woman who had abandoned her own kind. The climax arrived on a bleak, blustery afternoon. A mob, fueled by cheap whiskey and Thorne's poisonous rhetoric, marched toward the cabin. They carried torches and makeshift weapons, their faces contorted by a mixture of fear and fanaticism. Elias, alerted by the distant shouts, stood at the cabin door, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He clutched his largest hammer, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand, but his strength felt inadequate against the sheer numbers. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale but resolute, a forgotten shotgun gripped tightly in her trembling hands. This was not the future she had envisioned, not the safe haven she had so desperately sought. Thorn, at the head of the mob, bellowed accusations, his voice thick with self-righteous fury, demanding Elias leave, demanding Sarah return to where she belonged, threatening to burn them out if they refused. The air crackled with menace, the scent of pine and fear. Elias, in a rare break from his stoic silence, spoke, his voice low but resonating with a deep ancestral power, a sound that seemed to cut through the mob's clamor. He did not threaten. He did not beg. He simply stated his right, his belonging to this land, a truth deeper than any man's decree. But words were not enough. The mob surged forward, a wave of dark intent. The final stand had arrived, not in a grand battle, but in the desolate quiet of a remote clearing. Two souls against a world determined to break them. The clash was brutal, swift, and entirely devoid of any heroism. Elias, driven by a primal need to protect the fragile life he had painstakingly built, and the woman who had come to share it, met the mob's charge with a ferocity born of desperation. His hammer swung in wide, arcing blows, not to kill, but to incapacitate, to deter, to carve out a fleeting moment of space. Sarah surprisingly held her own, firing the shotgun into the air, its roar momentarily scattering the more timid members of the mob, then reloading with fumbling haste. Her fear transformed into a cold, hard resolve. She saw the glint of a knife, the flash of a fist, the raw, ugly hatred in the eyes of the men, and she understood, with chilling clarity, that this was not merely about land or prejudice. It was about annihilation. Elias took a heavy blow to his side, stumbling but not falling, his gritted teeth a testament to his pain and his refusal to yield. He was a force of nature, a silent whirlwind against the encroaching chaos. The battle raged, brief yet agonizing, punctuated by the shouts of the mob, the grunts of exertion and the sickening thud of impacts. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Not because Elias had vanquished them all, but because the violence, in its raw, unfiltered ugliness, had begun to turn back on itself. A few of Thorn's men, sobered by the sight of blood and the unexpected ferocity of Elias's defense, began to falter, their bravado giving way to apprehension. The mob, without a clear victory and fearing the consequences of actual murder, began to disperse, melting back into the shadows from which they had come, leaving behind only the trampled earth, the acrid smell of smoke, and the heavy silence of the aftermath. Thorn, bruised and humiliated, glared back at the cabin, his eyes promising a revenge that felt both inevitable and profoundly personal. In the stunned quiet, Elias slumped against the doorframe, his breath ragged, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she assessed his wound. The immediate danger had passed, but the air was thick with the weight of what had transpired, a chilling testament to the fragile line between order and savagery. And in that moment, a profound truth settled between them, a revelation unspoken but deeply felt. They were truly alone, and their survival depended on the strength of their unyielding, unconventional bond. The raw wound in Elias's side was more than just flesh and blood. It was a physical manifestation of the lacerations inflicted upon his spirit, a testament to the brutal cost of his existence. Sarah, her hand steady despite the lingering tremors of fear, tended to him with a quiet efficiency, her movements practiced from years of caring for her own hidden wounds. The cabin, scarred by the night's violence, became a chamber of solemn reflection. The silence that had once defined their interactions now held a different quality, no longer one of wary distance but of a profound, shared exhaustion, a silent acknowledgement of the depths they had plumbed together. There were no grand declarations, no emotional outpouring. Their bond had been forged in the crucible of fire and blood, tempered by a mutual understanding of hardship. Elias watched her, truly saw her, in those long, quiet hours of recovery. He saw the resilience in her tired eyes, the strength in her gentle touch, a strength that was not born of brute force, but of an enduring spirit, a refusal to be utterly consumed. And Sarah, in turn, saw beyond his stoicism, beyond the physical scars, to the profound vulnerability beneath. She saw the fear, the anger, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had fought battles his entire life, simply to exist. The town would remain hostile, that much was clear. The mob's retreat was not a surrender but a tactical withdrawal, a promise of future retribution. Their peace, if it could be called that, was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by the unseen currents of prejudice that flowed through the land. Yet, in that stillness, a new kind of resolve solidified. The cabin, battered but still standing, was more than just shelter. It was a symbol of their defiance, their refusal to be driven out. It was a testament to the enduring power of two disparate souls, finding common ground in shared adversity. Elias, though weakened, felt a strange lightness, a lifting of a lifelong burden. The battle had stripped away the last vestiges of pretense, revealing the raw, untamed truth of their connection. They had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, had found a light within each other, a flicker of hope that had survived the storm. The scars would remain, a permanent etching of their ordeal, but they were also a mark of survival, a testament to a strength that transcended mere physical might, a bond forged in the crucible of a world that sought to break them. The quiet aftermath of the confrontation settled over the cabin, not as peace but as a fragile truce. Elias, though healing, carried the physical reminder of the assault, a constant ache that resonated with the deeper wounds of his past. Sarah, moving through the familiar rhythm of daily tasks, observed the subtle shift in his demeanor. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer a void. It was a space filled with unspoken acknowledgments, with the weight of shared experience. They had survived together, and in that survival, a profound understanding had blossomed, deeper than any words could convey. It was a recognition of parallel journeys, of different paths leading to a similar destination, a desperate yearning for a place, a person, to belong to. Elias, in his quiet moments of reflection, understood that Sarah's strength was not the loud, defiant roar of a blacksmith's forge, but the silent, unyielding tenacity of a delicate vine, growing through rock. She had not flinched in the face of violence. She had stood by him, an unexpected fortress. And Sarah, watching him mend, saw not just the brute force but the profound gentleness in his hands when he tended to a small animal, the quiet devotion in his eyes when he gazed at the wild landscape. Their strengths, seemingly disparate, intertwined, creating a bond that transcended the superficial expectations of their world. The town's animosity still lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon, but within the cabin's walls, a new kind of world was being forged. It was not a world of grand pronouncements or societal acceptance, but one built on shared struggle, on the silent language of mutual respect and a burgeoning, tentative affection. The cabin, once a symbol of Elias's singular defiance, had now become a sanctuary for two, a testament to their combined resilience. They knew the future would be fraught with challenges, that the prejudice would not simply vanish. But they also knew, with a quiet certainty, that they would face it together, their unspoken promises echoing in the rhythmic clang of the hammer, in the quiet hum of their shared breath, a hopeful resolution blooming in the desolate land. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast western sky, cast long shadows across the cabin, painting the clearing in hues of gold and dust. Life for Elias and Sarah did not suddenly become easy, nor did the town's prejudice simply vanish. The scars of the confrontation lingered, both on Elias's body and in the wary glances of the occasional passerby. Yet, a fundamental shift had occurred. Their bond, forged in the crucible of violence, had deepened into an unshakable understanding. The quiet strength that Sarah had initially perceived in Elias was now mirrored in her own unwavering resolve. She had found a true haven, not in a place but in a person, in the silent, formidable presence of the Lakota blacksmith. And Elias, for the first time in a lifetime of solitude, had found a companion who saw beyond the societal labels, beyond the prejudice, to the very core of his being. He had built his cabin with his bare hands as a fortress against a world that sought to diminish him. But it was Sarah who had transformed it into a home, not with decorative flourishes, but with the quiet hum of her presence, the shared burdens, the unspoken comforts. The whispers in town might still persist, like the rustle of dry leaves, but they held less power now. The community's condemnation, once a suffocating weight, was diminished by the undeniable truth of their shared survival, the quiet dignity with which they faced each new day. Their story was not one of grand romance, but of profound resilience, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. It was a tale of two outsiders, cast adrift by their respective pasts, finding an unlikely anchor in each other. The cabin, solid and unyielding against the elements, stood as a monument to their struggle, a silent witness to the truth that strength was not merely physical might, but the unyielding spirit to build, to endure, to connect, even when the world conspired to tear you apart. And in the quiet evenings, as the stars began to pepper the inky sky, Elias and Sarah would sit by the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows on their faces, two souls finally, irrevocably, at home.